In 1878 Texas, a widow could lose everything she owned before the dirt on her husband's grave had settled. Lenora Vass was 26 years old when she found out exactly how true that was. She'd spent the 3 weeks after burying her husband Curtis sorting through papers at the kitchen table, while the September heat pressed down on the ranch like a hand over a mouth. Curtis had been a decent man, not brilliant, not careful with money, but decent. He'd worked their 140 acres outside Caldwell honestly, loved her honestly, and died honestly when his horse threw him at a creek crossing and the fall broke something inside his chest that no doctor in 3 counties could fix. What he hadn't told her about were the loans. 2 of them, taken out the previous spring through the Harker County Bank, signed in Curtis's careful handwriting, notarized and legal and totaling more money than the ranch would sell for even in a good year. The bank agent who came to the door on a Tuesday morning was polite about it, almost sorry-looking, which somehow made it worse. He handed her the papers and told her she had 30 days to settle the debt or surrender the property. The man who'd issued those loans was Judge Aldous Crane. Everyone in Caldwell knew his name. He owned the bank and the feed mill and 3,000 acres east of town, and a house in San Antonio, where people said he kept another life entirely. He'd come to Texas after the war with a law degree and a talent for finding what people needed most and making sure they had to buy it from him. Widows, struggling ranchers, families a bad season away from breaking. He found them all eventually. When Lenora walked into his office to ask for an extension, he smiled at her the way a man smiles when he's already decided how something ends. "There might be another arrangement," he said. She understood what he meant when the notice arrived the following week about the property auction. The morning it happened, the sky over Caldwell was the color of old brass. Lenora stood outside the county courthouse in a blue dress she'd worn to church every Sunday for 4 years, the hem still faintly stained from the mud of Curtis's burial, and watched men she'd known her entire life file past her without meeting her eyes. Some of them had come to eat at her table. Some had helped Curtis brand cattle in the spring heat. None of them spoke to her now. 2 other women stood near the courthouse steps. Adeline Pryor, a schoolteacher whose late father had died owing back taxes that somehow tripled in the accounting, and Bess Morrow, whose husband had left her a dry goods store and a debt she couldn't prove she hadn't signed. Both of them wore the same careful expression Lenora recognized from her own mirror that morning, the face of someone who'd run out of options but hadn't run out of pride. "How many men?" Adeline asked, not looking at anyone in particular. "Enough," Bess said. Crane arrived last, of course. He always did. He stepped down from a black carriage with the unhurried ease of a man who knew the outcome of every meeting before it started. He wore a gray suit and carried a silver-tipped walking stick he didn't need. 60 years old, gray at the temples, face like weathered limestone, hard and pale and patient. He found Lenora's eyes across the crowd and held them just long enough to make his point. She looked away first. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against her skirts and made herself breathe slow. The auction went fast. Adeline's property went to a cattle speculator from Dallas, who never even looked at her. Bess stood perfectly still while 2 men argued over her store's inventory, and when the gavel came down she turned and walked away without a word, and Lenora didn't see her again until much later. Then the sheriff called her name. 140 acres, registered to the estate of Curtis Vass. Outstanding debt of $1,200. Bidding opens at $1,500. Crane raised his hand before the sheriff finished the sentence. 1,500. The crowd went quiet the way crowds do when everyone already knows the answer, but nobody wants to say it out loud. Lenora stood at the top of the courthouse steps and felt the ground tilt under her feet. Not fear exactly. Something past fear. The hollow place you reach when you've already grieved everything you can grieve and now you're just watching the last piece go. 2,000. The voice came from the back of the crowd. Lenora didn't see him at first, just heard the voice, low and certain. The kind of voice that didn't raise itself because it had never needed to. The crowd shifted and she saw him then, standing at the edge of the gathering like he'd walked out of the brush country, rather than come up the road like a normal man. He was tall, not remarkable in any single feature except the stillness of him, the way he stood while everything moved around him. Canvas coat, worn boots, a hat that had seen better years. A scar ran along the left side of his jaw, faded silver against darker skin, old enough that whatever made it was long past. He looked like a man who'd stopped expecting the world to be reasonable some time ago and made his peace with that. Crane turned slowly. "I don't know you, Gideon Marsh." The man's voice didn't change. "I know you." Something moved in Crane's expression. Not quite recognition, but close. He raised his hand again. 2,200, 3,000. A sound moved through the crowd, not quite a gasp, more like the sound of people recalculating. Crane's jaw tightened. 3,000 is above assessed value. I'm aware. You're interfering in a legal proceeding. I'm bidding, Marsh said. You set the rules. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Lenora could see Crane working through it, measuring angles, deciding. He was a careful man. He didn't do stupid things in front of witnesses. Going once, the sheriff said, with the particular tone of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. Going twice. Crane's hand stayed down. Sold. Gideon Marsh walked through the crowd like it parted for him, which it mostly did. He stopped at the base of the courthouse steps and looked up at Lenora. Up close, she could see his eyes were dark brown, not hard but serious, the eyes of someone who'd learned to watch things carefully before acting. I'm not going to pretend this situation is anything other than what it is, he said. You don't know me. You don't have any reason to trust me. But Crane will find another way at you before nightfall if you stay in this town, and right now I'm the only thing between you and that. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at Crane, who was speaking quietly with two men near his carriage, his face composed again, giving nothing away. What do you want? She asked. Nothing you haven't already agreed to give. He held out a folded piece of paper, the deed, already signed over in her name. The property's yours. I just paid what you couldn't. We can settle the rest later, but later needs to happen somewhere that isn't here. She took the deed. The paper felt heavier than it should. All right, Lenora said, but I'll need my things from the house. How long? 20 minutes. Something shifted in his face, barely visible. I'll have the horses ready. They rode out of Caldwell as the afternoon light turned low and golden, Lenora with a saddlebag over one arm that held everything she'd been able to grab in 20 minutes. Her mother's Bible, Curtis's watch, 3 changes of clothes, and a tin box she didn't open in front of Marsh because she wasn't ready to explain what was in it. The gelding she rode was steady and patient. Marsh rode slightly ahead and to her left, which she noticed and which kept the wind from hitting her directly. She noticed things like that. Curtis always said she had an accountant's eye for detail and a lawyer's memory for insult. She wasn't sure he'd meant it as a compliment. Where are we going? She asked when the town was well behind them. South. I've got land in Frio County. 40 miles. 40 miles. We'll stop before dark. There's a homestead I use when I come through this way, empty this time of year. Lenora processed this. You come through Caldwell regularly, twice a year, roughly, and you knew about Crane. A pause. I knew about Crane. She waited, but he didn't add anything, so she decided to let it sit and come back to it. There was time. 40 miles was a long way, and she had a feeling Gideon Marsh was the kind of man who said things once and expected you to pick them up off the floor. They stopped at dusk at an old homestead, stone foundation, sod roof, chimney that still drew, 3 miles off the main road. Marsh built a fire without ceremony and produced dried beef and cornbread from his saddlebag while Lenora saw to both horses. She'd been riding since she was 8 years old. She didn't need help. Tell me why, she said while they ate. Marsh set his cup down. The firelight caught the scar along his jaw. Your husband came through Frio County 2 years ago, selling horses. He camped on my land for a night. We played cards. He told me about the ranch in Caldwell. He also told me about Crane. He paused. Told me Crane had been pressuring him about the water rights on the eastern edge of his property, creek that fed 3 other parcels. Lenora went still. Curtis never mentioned that to me. Men don't always. Not unkind, just factual. He said he'd documented some things. Kept records about properties Crane had acquired, the pattern of how it worked. Loans that grew, taxes that were reassessed, accidents. He looked at her steadily. He said if anything ever happened to him, his wife would know where to look. The tin box in her saddlebag suddenly felt like it had a heartbeat. He didn't tell me anything, Lenora said. Not specifically. But you grabbed a box when you had 20 minutes. She met his eyes. He wasn't accusing. He was just watching, the way he watched everything. I don't know what's in it, she said. I found it in the floorboards of the barn 3 days after he died. I didn't open it because... She stopped. Because if it was what I thought it was, opening it alone felt like inviting something I wasn't ready for. Marsh nodded slowly. Might be better to know than not. Might be. Lenora looked at the fire. But not tonight. He didn't push it. That was the first thing she learned about Gideon Marsh. He didn't push. His property in Frio County was not what she expected. She'd imagined something rough, a working cattle operation run lean and hard, the kind of place a solitary man kept functional and nothing more. What she found was a house that had been built to last. Limestone walls, deep porch, real glass windows, and a yard where someone had planted rosemary along the fence line, and a kitchen garden that was overgrown but not abandoned. You live here alone? She asked. 7 years. You planted a kitchen garden. A man has to eat. Lenora looked at the overgrown rosemary and decided not to say what she was thinking. She was a guest. She had nowhere else to go. She could be diplomatic for at least 48 hours. He gave her the bedroom and took the front room for himself, and in the morning she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of him somewhere outside. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet of a place that held no history for her, and felt something she had in weeks. Not safety exactly, more like the absence of immediate threat, which was close enough. The tin box was still in her saddlebag. She got up and opened it. Curtis's handwriting covered 6 pages of folded paper. Dates, names, amounts, parcels. A map of Harker County with properties marked in 2 colors, those Crane had owned before the war and those he'd acquired since. The second color covered half the map, notes about men who'd died. A water dispute in 1874 where the losing party's barn burned down 3 days after the verdict. A list of 9 names with the word P written beside 4 of them, dead beside 2, and Fled beside 1. At the bottom, a single sentence in Curtis's handwriting. If you're reading this, Lenora, I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. Find Marsh in Frio County. He knows the rest. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at that sentence for a long time. When she came outside, Marsh was splitting wood at the side of the house. He stopped when he saw her face. He sent me to you, she said. He planned this. He hoped it wouldn't be necessary, but he planned it. Marsh set the axe down. 2 years ago, after I met him, I started keeping my own records. What I'd seen on the western edge of Frio County. Survey markers that moved. A creek that was partially dammed on Crane's land upstream. I sent copies of what I had to Curtis, and he sent me what he had. We'd been building a case, without telling me. He was protecting you. Lenora heard the words clearly and felt 2 contradictory things about them at exactly the same time. Gratitude that Curtis had been thinking of her. Fury that he'd thought of her as someone who needed protecting from the truth rather than someone who could help carry it. How far along were you, she asked, before he died? Far enough to be dangerous. Not far enough to act, and now? Marsh looked at her for a moment. Now you're here. Which changes the calculation. He didn't explain that. She thought about it while she spent the rest of that day learning the layout of his property, walking the fence lines, checking where the creek ran along the eastern edge. The water was clear and cold. The dam she found half a mile north on land she'd need to trespass on to reach was unmistakable. She came back to the house at dusk with her boots muddy and her mind moving fast. There's enough here, she said. The dam alone is evidence. If we can prove it's on Crane's land and documents show when it went in, we'd need a judge who isn't on Crane's payroll to hear it. There any? Marsh was quiet for a moment. Federal circuit judge named Harwick does his rounds through this district every spring. He's out of Austin, not local. From what I've heard, he hasn't been bought. When does he come through? 4 months. 4 months. Lenora stood in the doorway and looked out at the darkening yard. 4 months was long enough for Crane to regroup. Long enough for him to come looking. He'll know you outbid him, she said. He'll know you brought me here. Yes. Are you worried about that? Marsh picked up a piece of wood and turned it in his hands. I've been worried about it since I left Caldwell, but I was more worried about what would happen to you if I didn't. She looked at him then, really looked, in the way she hadn't allowed herself to yet. He was maybe 35, the kind of face that had been younger once and forgot. There was a deliberateness to the way he moved, the way he spoke, that told her something bad had happened to him, and he'd decided to become careful instead of bitter. She recognized the decision, if not the specifics. Why? She asked. It was the question she'd been holding back since Caldwell. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, Curtis told me about you. Said you were the kind of person who'd fight the right thing and lose if nobody helped. Said the world was full of people like Crane, and not enough people willing to stand between them and the ones who couldn't defend themselves. He set the wood down. I have land nobody can take from me and no good reason not to use some of it. Lenora didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. Some things deserved to be let alone for a while. The first attempt came 3 weeks later. 2 of Crane's men rode up the road in the early morning, before the mist had cleared. Lenora saw them from the kitchen window and felt the cold drop in her stomach that she was starting to recognize as her body making decisions before her mind caught up. She had a rifle in her hands before Marsh appeared from the barn, and she was already at the porch when the men reined up. We're looking for a woman named Vass, the older one said. He had the specific tone of a man who'd done this kind of errand many times. No one by that name here, Marsh said. We have information saying she's on this property. Your information's wrong. The man's eyes moved to Lenora and stopped. She looked back at him without blinking. Ma'am, he said, with the faintly apologetic tone of someone about to do something he'd rather not. Mr. Crane is concerned for your welfare, given that you were— I'm fine, Lenora said. Thank you for asking. A beat. He'd like to speak with you directly. I'm sure he would. The silence stretched. Marsh hadn't moved or reached for anything, but his position in the yard was specific in a way Lenora was starting to understand. He'd placed himself so that either man would have to come through him to reach the porch. The two men looked at each other and then at Marsh, and whatever they saw there made a decision for them.
"We'll pass along your regards," the older one said. They rode back down the road the same way they'd come. "They'll be back," Lenora said. "With more men," Marsh agreed. He turned and looked at her. "You handled yourself."
"I grew up on a working ranch. I've been handling myself since I was 12. She paused.
"Though I appreciate you being in the yard."
Something moved at the corner of his mouth.
"I appreciate you having the rifle." She'd started shooting every morning by the second week.
Not because she couldn't already hit what she aimed at. She could, but because Marsh had built a range at the south end of the property, and the routine of it felt useful. Something she could improve at. He corrected her grip once, showed her a steadier stance for distance shots, and then left her to it,
which was the right approach.
She didn't need someone to hold her hand through the mechanics. She needed to stop flinching when she thought about having to use it for something real. By the fourth week, she had stopped flinching. Crane's second attempt was more sophisticated. A county deputy arrived with a writ, citing an ordinance about unlicensed occupation of property by non-residents. It was meaningless on its face. The property was Marsh's, and Lenora was his invited guest, but it was the kind of document that could tie them in local courts for months, while Crane maneuvered around them. They filed a counterclaim through a lawyer in San Antonio that Marsh contacted by mail.
While they waited, Lenora worked.
She rode into Frio County's small settlement twice a week, asking careful questions of the right people. A postmaster who'd seen Crane's surveyors on the creek in 1875. A widow 3 parcels over who'd lost her land to a tax reassessment she was certain had been falsified. A retired land agent who'd kept records of every survey he'd done in the county for 30 years, and who, it turned out, had noticed the same discrepancies Curtis had.
His name was Aldous Pruitt. He was 70, moved slowly, and kept his records in a cedar chest under his bed because he'd never quite trusted banks.
"I wondered when someone would come," he said, when Lenora explained why she was there.
"You knew?" "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know who to tell."
He paused. "Crane has friends in the county seat, and at my age, making enemies doesn't seem worth the trouble unless you're sure someone's going to do something about it."
"I'm going to do something about it,"
Lenora said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up and pulled out the cedar chest. Marsh didn't say anything when she came back with Pruitt's records, which she'd copied by hand over 3 hours at his kitchen table. He just moved the lamp to give her better light and made coffee. She worked until midnight. When she finally set the pen down, her hand was cramped and her eyes ached, but she had something she hadn't had before, a map of what Crane had done, so complete and so specific that denying it would require denying mathematics. "We need to get this to Harwick before Crane figures out what we have," she said.
"He's still 2 months out. Can we reach him before his circuit? Send word?" Marsh thought about it. His clerk is based in Austin. If we send copies ahead and he receives them before he leaves, he might move the schedule. He'd need a reason. Attempted intimidation of witnesses, unlawful seizure of property, corruption of county officials. Marsh looked at her across the table. "I think we can make a case." They spent the next week writing it. Marsh knew the legal structure and Lenora knew how to organize evidence, and together they built a document that laid out everything from the first fraudulent loan to the current writ. Curtis's records, Pruitt's surveys, the dam, the list of names, the 2 dead men. When it was done, Marsh rode to San Antonio himself to put it on the Austin stage. While he was gone, 3 men arrived at the property. Lenora saw them from the kitchen window and knew before they dismounted that these weren't like the first 2. These were not county deputies with writs or Crane's regular men with polite requests. These were the kind of men you sent when polite had stopped working. She had the rifle and the revolver and 4 horses in the barn, and exactly none of the things she'd need to outrun 3 armed men across open country. She thought about it for approximately 10 seconds, and then she went out the back. She didn't run. Running was conspicuous. She walked to the barn, saddled the bay mare, and came out the far side of the building into the brush country. She heard the men at the front of the house, heard someone trying the door, and she kept moving south along the creek line where the brush was thick enough to cover her. She made it to Pruitt's house in an hour. He opened the door before she knocked. "Men at Marsh's place," she said. "How many?" 3. "Armed." He nodded, unsurprised. "My grandson's in town. He can ride." The grandson, a boy of about 16 named Jesse who had the look of someone who'd been waiting for something useful to do, rode for the county settlement at a pace that suggested he understood the assignment. Lenora stayed at Pruitt's and did not let herself imagine what was happening 3 miles north. Marsh came back at dusk. He was, as far as she could tell, entirely uninjured, and the 3 men were not with him,
which she chose not to ask about in detail.
You went to Pruitt's, he said. They weren't there to talk.
He nodded. There was a scrape along his right forearm that he hadn't had that morning, and he moved to the basin and cleaned it without being asked. Lenora found herself standing in the doorway watching him and deliberately went to put the kettle on instead. We need to move faster, she said. Crane knows we're building something. The next men he sends won't be turned away. Harwick's clerk responded. Marsh took the folded letter from his coat and handed it to her.
He's moving the schedule. He'll be in Uvalde in 3 weeks. 3 weeks.
Lenora read the letter twice and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since September.
3 weeks is manageable, she said. It's also enough time for Crane to do something drastic. Then we stay alert.
Marsh looked at her with an expression she was starting to be able to read. It wasn't quite concern. It was closer to the look of a man recalculating risk in real time.
You're not scared. I'm terrified, Lenora said. I've been terrified since the morning the bank agent knocked on my door.
But terrified and helpless are different things, and I'm only willing to be one of them.
He was quiet for a moment. Curtis said that. Almost exactly. She felt the small familiar pain of it, and then it passed. He was a good man.
He taught me that particular lesson, among others.
She set the letter on the table.
I'd like to believe he knew what he was doing when he pointed me in your direction. He was the most organized man I ever met, Marsh said. He also worried too much.
He was right to worry. He was. But he should have told you. Lenora thought about that. About the tin box and the barn floorboards. About the sentence at the bottom of the page. Yes, she said. He should have, but he didn't, and we're here anyway. She looked at Marsh. I want you to know,
when this is done, whatever Crane has on the Vass property, I intend to see it returned.
I don't expect you to carry that. I didn't bid $3,000 in Caldwell expecting to be repaid. I know you didn't. I'm telling you anyway. She met his eyes. I pay my debts.
He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face shifted.
Not dramatically. Just moved.
Like a piece of furniture being settled into the right place after a long time in the wrong one.
All right, he said.
Noted. Crane made his final move 10 days before Harwick's scheduled arrival in Uvalde. He came himself this time, which told Lenora everything she needed to know about how afraid he was. He arrived with 6 men and a county sheriff's deputy, and a warrant he waved from the seat of his carriage like he'd already won, and Lenora met him at the gate.
Mrs. Vass, he said, with the familiar tone of someone managing a situation, you've been caused a great deal of unnecessary trouble.
I want you to know I take no pleasure in what's happened. I believe that's not quite true, Lenora said. His mouth tightened. The warrant is for Gideon Marsh, for interference in a legal proceeding and the unlawful harboring of. The proceeding was a fraudulent auction conducted under false documentation, Lenora said.
I've submitted evidence to that effect to Federal Circuit Judge Harwick, who will be in Uvalde in 10 days. I'd advise you to review your own paperwork before that meeting, because I've had access to your original surveys, and they don't match what you filed. Silence.
Crane's expression went through several things in quick succession, then it went still.
That's a serious accusation.
Yes, Lenora said.
It is.
The deputy beside Crane shifted on his horse. He was young, and he was beginning to look uncomfortable in the way people look when they realize they've walked into something much larger than they understood.
The warrant, Crane began, is for Marsh, Lenora said, not for me. I'm a free woman standing on property whose deed is in my name. She held up the folded deed. If you'd like to serve your warrant, you're welcome to try.
But I'd suggest you think carefully about doing it in front of a witness who will be testifying before a federal judge in 10 days.
Pruitt had appeared at the corner of the house at some point during this exchange. He was 70 years old and moved slowly, but he was there, and Crane saw him.
The calculation happened behind Crane's eyes. Lenora watched it happen and kept her face neutral.
This isn't finished, Crane said. No, she agreed. It isn't. But how it finishes is still something you have a choice about. He looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man realizing the person across from him is not going to do the reasonable thing and disappear. Then he turned his carriage around. The 6 men followed. The deputy was the last to go. He
glanced at Lenora with an expression that might have been apology, or might have been relief, and then touched his hat and rode. Marsh appeared from behind the house. He'd been there the whole time, she knew. Present enough to matter, absent enough to let her handle it.
You knew he'd fold, he said.
I knew he didn't want a federal judge involved.
His entire system depends on staying local. She exhaled slowly, feeling the adrenaline start its retreat. He'll try something before Uvalde, but it'll be smaller. He's running out of moves that don't require witnesses. She was right.
There were 2 more attempts in the following days. A fire set in the barn's hayloft that they caught early enough to stop, and a rider who showed up at Pruitt's house trying to buy the old man's silence. Pruitt told him where to put the money in terms that would not have been appropriate in Sunday services, and reported the visit to the San Antonio lawyer, who added it to the growing file. By the time they rode into Uvalde for the federal hearing, they had documentation covering 14 years of Crane's fraudulent land acquisitions, testimony from 6 witnesses, 3 surveys contradicting official county records,
and a dam that a federal surveyor had personally examined and photographed the previous week. Judge Harwick was a thin man in his 50s, with the patient expression of someone who had heard every possible human excuse for dishonesty and had stopped being surprised by any of them. He read everything. He asked careful questions.
He gave Crane's lawyers 3 days to present counter-arguments, which they used to their fullest extent and which ultimately moved nothing. Lenora testified for most of the second day. She stood in front of the federal court and told the truth from beginning to end. The loans, the auction, the tin box, the ride south, the men at the gate, the fire in the hayloft. She talked about Curtis, about what he'd built and what he'd documented and what it had cost him.
She talked about Adeline Pryor and Bess Morrow and the other women whose names were in the records. She did not cry, which she was proud of. She came close twice but held it. When she was done, Harwick looked at her over his spectacles. "You understand the scope of what you're alleging." "I understand it completely," Lenora said. "The documentation supports every word." It did.
Crane was remanded to federal custody before the week ended. His properties were frozen. The fraudulent loans were voided. 3 county officials who'd been on his payroll resigned in the span of 48 hours, which was its own kind of evidence. Adeline Pryor's land was returned to her. Bess Morrow was located in San Marcos, where she'd started over running a boarding house, and the documentation for her store's original ownership was found in Crane's own files, intact.
Lenora stood in the Uvalde courthouse yard after the final ruling and felt the particular hollowness that comes after a long fight ends.
She'd expected something larger, a feeling of completion, of rightness. What she felt was just exhausted, and underneath the exhaustion, quiet, the long, unfamiliar kind.
Marsh came to stand beside her. "It's done," he said. "It is."
She looked at the courthouse steps.
"I keep waiting to feel something more." "It comes later," he said. "Or it doesn't. But either way, you did what needed doing." She thought about Curtis, about the tin box, about the sentence at the bottom of the page that had sent her south toward a man her husband trusted before she'd ever heard his name. She thought about what it meant to be handed a future you hadn't planned for and to find, somewhere in the middle of the difficulty of it, that you preferred it to the one you'd lost. "What happens to the property?" she asked.
"Not her property. His. What do you mean?"
"You spent $3,000. You spent 3 months. You've had men try to burn your barn." She turned to look at him. "What happens now for you?"
Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I go back to Frio County."
"Same as before, alone. That was the arrangement." "Before," Lenora said. "Before you knew about the tin box and the dam and Pruitt's records.
Before I spent 3 months learning which floorboards in your house creak, and that you put too much salt in everything you cook." She held his gaze.
"Things change." He looked at her with that careful, watching expression she'd come to understand was his version of feeling something large. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm not going back to Caldwell. The house is gone, the land was seized, and everything I built there belonged to a version of my life that's over."
She paused. "I'm saying the kitchen garden at your property is overgrown, and I have strong opinions about Rosemary, and I'd like to stay if you'll have me."
The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that happens when 2 people are both deciding something at the same time and neither of them wants to say it wrong.
"I'll have you," Marsh said. Quiet and direct and nothing extra, which was exactly right. Lenora nodded.
"Then let's go home."
They rode back to Frio County as the October sun dropped behind the hill country and turned the sky every color that doesn't have a proper name. She didn't need to take his hand or say anything else.
They rode side by side in comfortable silence,
and the silence felt like something built rather than something absent, the way good things do when you've earned them the hard way.
The kitchen garden got replanted in the spring. The rosemary came back on its own, stubborn as everything worth keeping.
Lenora added sage and thyme and a border of black-eyed Susans along the fence, because she'd always meant to have them, and now she had the thyme in the ground, and no one to tell her otherwise. Adeline Pryor wrote twice that first year, long letters about the school she was rebuilding, and the people who'd stopped leaving Harker County now that Crane was gone. Bess Morrow sent a single card, with a pressed flower inside, and 4 words in her sharp handwriting: "Better. Thank you. Both." Other women came, over the years. Not many. Word traveled slowly in that country, but some. A girl of 19 with a bruised wrist and a brother's debt she hadn't made. A widow from Medina County who'd been told her late husband's land had reverted to county control under a statute that, it turned out, did not exist. a schoolteacher from the hill country who knew too much about her employer's finances for his comfort. Lenora helped when she could, money when she had it, which she usually did, because she was good with numbers and had made something of the Frio County land. Information when money wasn't the problem.
And always, always the particular thing that had mattered most when she'd needed it herself.
Someone willing to stand between her and the worst of it while she learned to stand up on her own.
Marsh never said much about any of it.
He built an extra room onto the house the second year, which she didn't ask about, and she didn't need to.
He was that kind of man, quiet where it mattered and present where it counted, the kind of partner you stopped noticing the absence of because he was never absent.
On the 5th anniversary of the Uvalde hearing, Lenora found him at the kitchen table with Pruitt's original survey maps spread in front of him, comparing them to current county records.
Still checking? She asked.
Crane's gone, Marsh said, but the system that made him isn't. Lenora looked at the maps.
She thought about Curtis, who'd spent years building a case alone in a barn in Caldwell, and about what he'd understood that most people didn't.
That one man's corruption was just the visible piece of something larger, and that fighting it meant fighting it at the root, not just the branch.
What do you need? She asked.
Marsh looked up at her. After 5 years, his face had grown more familiar to her than her own, every line and angle of it, the scar along his jaw, the careful eyes. The specific stillness of him that she'd once read as coldness and now understood was something else entirely, a kind of attention, turned always outward, toward the world and the people in it. You?
He said simply. And another 2 hours with the lamp.
Lenora sat down across from him and pulled the nearest map toward her and got to work.